is busy at the end of the year, so I'm sure that you'll appreciate if we finish before the 2 hours that we had allocated to this meeting. So welcome everyone to the last RG2 of 2021. I'm glad that we made it all the way to this point. It's not finished, but we are almost there. And I just wanted to walk you through the agenda. We will have first housekeeping issues, including turning my phone. Please note that the meeting will be recorded, but this is just for taking note purposes. I hope this is okay with everyone. Otherwise, please let us know. Please mute your microphones when you're not speaking, because that will help everyone. You have the live captioning for this meeting, so you can access it through the CC button in your screen, and then you will see the captions. And please feel free to use the chat to make any comments today, and we will be picking up on each of them. Or questions. So as I said, we have a very full agenda. We are going to have an update on the RG2 tools.
I found this other recipe I want to try. I think you'll really like it.
Yeah, I would really like that recipe too. Thank you. Please share recipes or whatever you want to share. It's all most welcome. So we will give a brief update on the RG2 tools, focusing largely on the operationalization of them. Then we're going to dedicate a large part of the meeting to the identification of priorities for 2022, and we recognize there are a certain number of uncertainties regarding the structure of the RG2 in 2022 and 23, but we are sure that the essence of the group will continue, because AAP is very high on the agenda. I mean, it's one of the priorities of the incoming, of Martin Griffiths and the Interagency Standing Committee. And we'll have also the opportunity to give some feedback, very quick feedback on the meeting that we had, the OPAC meeting that we had that was dedicated to AAP and some other important developments. Then Wendy and Gareth will be providing a brief update on the PSEA review findings, as well as the 2022 priorities for PSEA. And then finally, Oliver Lott from ODI has accepted to talk about your recent research on participation and inclusion in the Rohingya crisis. We don't want to miss this opportunity. And then we'll have some space for AOBs. So if there is anything that you would like us to flag or to be aware of, please put it in the chat box and we will be picking up. So then with this, maybe let's move to the update on the operationalization of the collective AAP tools, and we have Ben to present this part. So over to you, Ben.
Thanks, Marichel. Hi, everyone. So in short, the operationalization of the AAP tools. So you can see here the results tracker, the AAP framework, complaints and feedback mechanisms, as well as the accountability and inclusion portal being referenced. So the AAP framework and the results tracker are now on the provisional release for 2022, and will help guide humanitarian country teams to develop and monitor their operational country-specific AAP action plans. Important to note that both tools operationalization is country-led, enriching them and ensuring contextualization and ownership with strong HC and HCT leadership. As the response level feedback mechanisms are also increasing part of this work, they will also beneficiate from the guidance and practical tools that were developed this year that will be tested and adapted to fit operational needs in countries. That is mainly in terms of the participatory design of CFMs, as well as looking into the sharing of data and good principles for that data sharing to enable safe and actionable aggregation of feedback. The Accountability and Inclusion portal will continue to host best practices, guidance, and resources. And we encourage you all to register and share those resources and contribute to the blogs, as well as enter information in the directory so that different organizations can be recognized there. All these resources will work towards making respective responses more accountable at country levels. So we'll zoom in into CFM first, then our colleague Catherine will talk around the results tracker, and Rachel will present some of the country planning for operationalization of the AAP tools going forward. So if you could put, yes, thank you, the next slide. So first, substream 1 on participatory design of CFM, thanks to UNHCR and CDAC for leading this one. So we have revised MSNA questions as well as guidance to use those in terms of how to do participatory design of CFMs. So the MSNA questions being the basics, but the guidance also it helps you to use them for focus groups and key interviews. So we have guidance and plus a page of resources from partner organizations that have also developed participatory design tools that are already available. So the next steps are to make this available online for use to support development of CFMs in operation and investigate and support further participatory aspects of CFMs. Then the CFM Substream 2, a draft pocket card for all sensitive complaints. So CHS and other colleagues have worked towards identifying key issues and opportunities there. In the first quarter of 2022, we will have consultation planning based on those identified opportunities, options, and challenges. And thanks to CHS for working on this with us. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So the third stream, CFM on data standards and principles. We have an overall structure around 5 key steps: design of data system, receipt of feedback data, triage and initial response, preparation and sharing of feedback data, and use of that feedback. With a general structure based on what you can see on the right here, which would be minimum standards, minimum requirements, and relevant key definitions, as well as broader data standard packages that would be more geared towards staff managing feedback mechanism, typically with a data background. So I think that there's still discussions, and tomorrow there's a last call on this around refining the format for better usage and prioritization of content around the management, CEA, AAP focal points, as well as the staff managing feedback with a data background. The next steps for these streams are to have a version 1 made available for testing and refining the scope and content with various types of actors that are already working on CFM in countries throughout 2022, and then learn from that and consolidate with other resources, including the CBCM update guide. And that's it for me. And next slide will be with Catherine.
Thanks, Ben. And just before I jump into how we've operationalized the tools this year and how we're going to operationalize the results tracker for next year, I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to all the colleagues on this call that have helped develop the results tracker so far. It's been a lot of heavy lifting from a lot of you, and I'd just like to really say thanks to our GTS and our REACH colleagues, our OCHA colleagues who've provided data on the HNO and the HRP, and all of our gender and protection colleagues who've helped us think this through and provide data. So I just wanted to quickly take the opportunity to say thank you to you all and to plead for your kind consideration next year to continue the work, which I'm sure you will. So moving on now to looking at how we operationalize the results tracker for this year. We did a 2-track process, firstly, which was engagement with the global data sources, including those that I've just mentioned. This process was designed to consolidate the indicators and results and reduce the duplication that existed, and to really help understand what AAP data was being collected across the system, what the gaps were, and how those gaps could be closed at a data level by collecting new information. And that's been a really great exercise because it's really helped us understand what information is being collected and how is it being used currently. And we can take that learning forward into next year. Alongside that process, we've worked with our country colleagues, and we've started field testing in Bangladesh, Somalia, Central African Republic, Haiti, and Gaziantep. And the purpose of that field testing is to provide initial feedback and really help us understand how the tool can be operationalized and localized to actually identify the gaps at a response level and how to close them. If we can move on to the next slide, please. I just wanted to take the opportunity to give a few reflections and initial feedback that we've heard on the results tracker and then move on to the next step. So in really good news, we've had excellent feedback that the structure of this results tracker is really welcome for practical use. The structure based around the CHS commitments and then subdividing into system and community indicators has been really useful for people to understand a holistic approach to AAP and to think about how what they do at the system level is experienced by the community, and to use those two pieces of information to identify gaps and plan actions. We've had lots of feedback that it can support the HPC cycle at a variety of stages, assessment, planning, monitoring, and also how the results in the results tracker can be used for advocating. Another really great finding has been that the gaps in data are just as useful to prioritise actions and allocate resources. So if, for example, there is no data on community perceptions on one particular area in the results tracker, that gap alone has been enough for people to reflect and think about whether we want to close that gap and how. So that's a really useful finding for us. And significantly for us at a global and sectoral level, this has been a two-way process with global data sources where we are extracting their data to use into the results tracker. But as I mentioned previously, we're also going back to the data sources and discussing how can they improve their AAP data collection based on country needs, but also gaps in global AAP data collection. So that the process kind of operating again at two levels, one kind of at the country level, really looking at the response level AAP action plans, and another at the global level, focusing on how we can improve AAP data collection. And those lessons are leading us towards what our operational next steps and priorities are for next year. And the first one is really that we want to increase the country-led design process and identification of appropriate indicators. And that will be really linked to the context and AAP planning at a response level. We also need to do some work on the structure of the tool so that it's more appropriate to the operational realities and can be kind of subdivided between the national, subnational level, and also whether the tool can speak across the triple nexus of humanitarian development and peace building. We also know that the tool needs to work at two levels, both for the technical and for leadership levels. So we'll be looking at the structure again to see how we can improve that for those two levels. And an area that we're really interested in is, as we go through this process, how can we improve coverage of AAP and CHS in areas that are less documented? For example, in localization, which fits underneath CHS Commitment 3, or coordination, which speaks to CHS Commitment 6, or our AAP staffing and resources and competencies, which fits under CHS 8. And finally, our resourcing for AAP, which will fit under CHS 9. These are all areas that aren't yet sufficiently covered in the results tracker, and it will be some work going forward to ensure they are included. And as always, there'll be more work on how to sustain leadership at all levels to further drive the development of the tool, the interagency collaboration, and the country-led ownership. So that's all for me. I think I'm handing back over to Rachel. Thanks.
Thanks, Catherine, and hi, everyone. So just to briefly step through what we're planning in terms of this operationalization. We've heard how the development of the tools has been almost completed to the stage where they can be fully applied or field tested and adapted as required to context-specific operational realities, as Catherine and Ben have described. So at the same time, we've also benefited this year from the championship of several humanitarian coordinators who've persistently committed to ensuring AAP is a priority, both in global discussions, but also in their own operations, which just to mention, and you may have heard, but which gained a lot of consensus at the annual retreat of HCs during October, as well as endorsed by the principals of the IASC during October as well. So it's recognised that while AAP is a priority, many of those responsible for ensuring that it's operational do express the need for support, tools, guidance, and clear examples of how this should be done. So therefore, we're working in the operations that they represent, which are listed here, to, there's that word again, operationalise the range of tools and guidance that we have developed through the results group's efforts over the past year or two. And you can see here that we anticipate several AAP workshops with HCTs led by HCs, focused on enabling and committing in-country leadership to response-wide AAP action plans in line with the guidance that's provided in the collective AAP framework and drawing on the range of tools that are available. So these workshops and subsequent activities are planned in the first 2 quarters of next year in Bangladesh, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Lebanon. So I'll mention a few of the highlights and outcomes of the workshop that we held in Gaziantep around a month ago, because I think it was very enlightening, and we talk a lot about operationalization here, but I think it was very enlightening about how it actually works and how the tools might be used and be effective at the operational level. So firstly, we can say that overall it was very successful in terms of building consensus and commitment around action towards response-wide accountability. But I want to highlight the reasons why that was the case, and I think there's a lot of learning for us about this. And it was really due to a set of important and very clear circumstances or conditions coming together. Firstly, the whole process was driven by the very strong leadership of the humanitarian coordinator, Mark Cutts, who had already demonstrated his commitment for example, by expanding the decision-making fora at both the country, well, the operational leadership and the intercluster leadership and decision-making forums to include more women and more Syrian NGOs. This was complemented by a commitment to a collective approach and demonstrated unity during the workshop and in the lead up to it around AAP, and doing better on this despite very real obstacles and despite quite a lot of fatigue actually in the response. So that came from a range of members of the Humanitarian Liaison Group and the ICCG. Thirdly, the strong participation of NGOs and diverse representation of affected communities in the workshop and in the processes that followed. And finally, the ISC providing dedicated capacity to support the leadership both strategically and technically to develop an action plan and to establish a task force of several UN agencies, NGOs, and others within the leadership group to carry this work forward, and importantly, to report on it and be accountable for it to that leadership group. So just one last comment on Gaziantep, that following the workshop, and this is sort of just something I learned yesterday, and to conclude, the Humanitarian Liaison Group yesterday endorsed the 10-point action plan that had been derived through a very iterative process from that started with the AAP framework and drilled down into 10 priority actions for change. So that will be led by a task force comprised of 1 donor, 4 NGOs and 4 UN agencies, with technical support from the AAP advisors and the REACH network. So as part of the HLG's commitment to the action plan, it also launched simultaneous translation in keeping with action point 1, which is enabling members to participate in English or Arabic. And it also involved the perceptions of affected persons and a briefing by frontline responders who obviously work in Syria, and the response there is cross-border, as you probably all know, and is remote. And that they will be standard practices moving forward at HLG meetings. So before I hand back, my final point is just to say that we're committed to closely observing and capturing the learning of this adaptation that we see in the operational contexts, so that we can improve and finalise the tools for full IASC endorsement in the third quarter of next year. And so they may be widely used to improve humanitarian responses more broadly. Thank you very much, and I think handing to you now, Bernadette.
Thank you, colleagues, and again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all. So as Mary-Chelle said in her introduction, we wanted to spend a good part of this meeting to identify with you what could be our priorities for continuing this work in 2022. There is, of course, an important caveat that we wanted to share with you, and that is that, as you know, it has been envisaged that the 5 resource groups under the OPAG will be transitioning in 2022 to task forces. And to date, there's not been a final decision made on whether and when RG2 will be discontinued and some of our work transferred to the proposed task forces. Nor has there been any decision yet in terms of the priorities, the leadership or coordination and composition of the different task forces. We felt, however, when preparing for this meeting, that given that we've always had very rich discussions with all of you, there would be a benefit in discussing with you, pulling together some ideas from all of you that we could then, Mary-Chelle and I, take up and share with the IASC Secretariat as the structures and the priorities of the IASC for 2020 to 2023 are being finalized. Now, to set the scene, we wanted to flag some of the recent developments that have taken place at the interagency level and that are relevant for our discussion today. First of all, at the level of the OPAG, so the Operational Policy and Advocacy Group of the IASC, there was the OPAG members met for the first time in close to 2 years in person in Geneva on the 23rd of November. And half of the meeting, the morning of that meeting, was dedicated to AAP. You'll recall that we had an ad hoc meeting with colleagues from IFRC and WFP on the 24th of September, where they presented to you some of the thinking that they had come up as co-chairs of the AAP task force put in place by the OPAG in May. And so at the meeting of the OPAG, on the 23rd of November, IFRC and WFP presented their proposal on AAP to OPAG members. While there was a general support for the proposal and the overall approach that was proposed in the document that many of you have commented on, it was also felt by OPAG members that the number of recommendations that they had come up with needed to be reduced and needed to be further prioritized. So this is something that colleagues from the AAP task force are still working on. Following the presentation of the AAP task force on their proposal, we did present our progress update on RG2. And we also highlighted some of the proposed next steps that we've just presented to you now on the rollout of the tracker, the results tracker and the AAP framework. So what we took away from the OPAC meeting as RG2 is, first of all, an immense support for the work that we have done with all of you. Second, we've asked and been and it has been endorsed that the results tracker and the AAP framework would be provisionally released by the IASC, and that they would then be further refined in 2022 through field testing. Here, I just want to mention that it is expected that we will need to report back, so Resource Group 2 or the future task force on accountability will need to report back to the OPAC on the operation of the tools in the third quarter of 2022. And then we took the opportunity of the OPAC meeting as well to really flag to OPAC members the strong connection between what we have done in RG2 and the AAP task force recommendations. We also flagged our commitment as co-chairs to support this work in the future. And particularly, we insisted on the need for all OPAC members to ensure and support the large dissemination of the tools that we have all come up with. Then I'll just finish this update on the OPAC meeting of the 23rd of November to let you know that the morning session so finished with a brief update from the IASC Secretariat on the revision of the YASC structure. What we know is that there will be a transition period between the resource groups and the task forces, and that will be during the first quarter of 2022. And this is to ensure a smooth transition. I just also finish here a final point to say, and that's also very relevant for the discussions we want to have with you now, is the fact that in the initial iteration of the priorities and the structure, proposed structure for the IASC in 2020 to 2023, the proposed task force on accountability does not refer to inclusion as such, and that some concerns have been raised about that with the IASC Secretariat. Now, beyond the OPAC, we felt it was important to also inform you, if you do not know, that ERC Martin Griffith has made AAP a very strong priority for 2020 to 2023, and also one of his personal priorities. Second, in October, the YASC principals agreed to issue a statement on AAP with the intention to give it the level of leadership support it requires. And so this statement is being drafted as I speak. And then finally, and I want to acknowledge the presence of Gareth and David from the Grand Bargain Participatory Revolution workstream here with us today, but it's to remember that AAP remains a top priority alongside localization of the Grand Bargain 2.0. So with this introductory remark to launch the discussion, I hand over to you, Mary-Chelle, so you can moderate contributions from colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. And there is already some comments in the chat from Uwe on the AAP adaptation initiatives moving forward, and asking for a description of the process. And Rachel, maybe you want to explain a little bit?
Thanks, Mary-Chelle. Yeah, and it's a good question, because I think we spent quite a bit of time thinking about this, you know, and sort of trying to work it out in a sort of way before launching it upon, you know, the places where we wanted to test the tools. As it turned out, it, you know, became increasingly clear to us that we needed to, you know, we were already working with a lot of these operations, and it was, you know, through discussions with them that we came to the process. And as I said, as well, it's very much led by the HCs and their teams who said, well, we have done this, you know, we've already tried this and this perhaps didn't work, or we didn't have a coordinator to carry it forward. We've done this analysis and this sort of understanding of all the different, for example, feedback mechanisms we have, but we really want to look at something that's a bit more coordinated. So the priorities were really set out of the groundwork that was already being done in country. And the further we understood that, the more we understood that we really needed to be driven, you know, by those teams, by those HCs who said, you know, what they wanted to prioritize. So, for example, in Gaziantep, Mark was very clear about wanting to prioritize the leadership of some of the NGOs, and particularly women, that he really championed in some of those Syrian NGOs. He set that as an absolute priority, and that he wanted to establish a task force to make sure that they were leading on this and that they were reporting back on it. So that's just one example. But I mean, I think in terms of the approach, we've been very flexible because we really do recognize that context is everything with something like this, that a lot of groundwork has been done by a lot of different agencies, and you know, that the priorities need to be set either by the HC with the HCT, recognizing that it's a leadership issue to be accountable to affected communities, and that it's not to be sort of relegated or delegated, and that they wanted to sort of champion processes that they've perhaps sometimes tried already or had sort of initial efforts towards and analysis around, and wanting to strengthen those. So perhaps what would be useful, I think, Marichal, if I may, is just to suggest that once we do some of that more clear analysis of that we can share that with this group in due course. I would say that will be in the first quarter of next year. Over.
Okay, thank you so much. Colleagues, any other hands on this topic or on what Bernadette has presented?
I do not see any other hands up for the moment. Perhaps colleagues need a little bit more time.
Yes, Bernadette.
Okay, so just maybe to prompt the discussion. So as we've just said, regardless of the future structure, AAP will be the subject of attention by the OPAC in 2022. Part of the work will be to really make sure that what we have done so far, the platform, the help desk, the results tracker, and the framework integrate the sort of the daily proceedings of country teams, that you know, colleagues are well acquainted with the tools, that they are usable, useful, and we've heard from Kate, you know, already positive feedback on, for example, the results tracker, and from Rachel similarly on the AAP framework. Now, in 2020, so really this is the work that we are focused on in 2020, 2021 in particular. And in 2021, we started working on complaints and feedback mechanisms, for instance. So the questions we're putting to you today is, should the IASC, the OPAC focus, continue to focus on AAP in the future? What could be the priorities that we should work on as a results group 2 type of structure? So really looking at policy, looking at advocacy, looking at guidance. Should we do more work on complaints and feedback mechanisms? Because we know that a lot remains to be done at the collective level on those. Should we have a stronger emphasis on inclusion? This is really a little bit what we wanted to discuss with you today. I hope it's helpful.
Thank you so much. We have a hand already from Amit. Amit, over to you.
Thanks so much to both. I really appreciate the updates, and I hope everyone can see and hear me. And I wanted to just perhaps, if I may, build on what Bernadette kindly outlined, because I think from the PSA perspective, what we really want to see is the convergence of these two elements: inclusive complaints and feedback mechanisms. We know that we have complaints mechanisms. I still think we have some way to go to verify in consultation with affected people that they're genuinely inclusive, geographically, linguistically, in terms of modality for people with disabilities, people who may have phones, who may not have phones, who may have data, who may not have data, who may find one mode safe and trusted and another mode more difficult or more daunting. Just from the external review conducted by the IASC of the PSEA approach, one of the elements that came out very strong, and I think it really shows the strength of RG2 to contribute and help fill gaps, is the need to validate approaches with affected people, which I think is really the core of RG2. But it's this element of bringing these two areas together. And if I may, I would really like to try to make a pitch to prioritize that within our work plan in the future, which is inclusive complaints and feedback mechanism through harnessing the membership structures with specialized organizations like Ground Truth Solutions, CDAC networks, entities that really focus on that ground-up community validation, that the complaint and feedback mechanisms are indeed well suited to diverse and local needs, and if they are not, that we commit to modify them to better reach the full spectrum of affected people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amit. Very good point. Charles Antoine, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. Just building on this point from Amit, just to give some feedback from a webinar we had. For those who don't know, I think some of the colleagues on the call were on at least some of those webinars. We had, as part of the work of RG2, we organized a series of webinars with PHAP, the network of professionals, humanitarian action and protection, to really make sure that some of the work we're doing within this group is also well understood, but also builds on some of the expectations and needs from practitioners in multiple countries. And the last of the series was actually on complaints and feedback mechanisms, just happened on Tuesday. We had, by the way, slightly over 400 participants, which is pretty significant, I would say. And what is interesting, I'm just saying that because it kind of confirms, in my view, the need to really continue this work and do it in a way that is really in support of what is needed and expected in various countries and programs. Because there were lots of questions, including before the webinar, PHAP sent questions to its members, and I think that's the one where we received most questions, the larger number. We had like 50 different questions, a lot about how to make sure those mechanisms are inclusive, lots of technical questions around collective mechanisms or how to coordinate them better. So very interesting points. So again, for me, just to highlight, this confirms that there are definitely needs in terms of getting more support or at least interactions with those who are sometimes struggling or sometimes benefiting from some kind of support. And there was one specific point, which was the fact that lots of these different experiences, they don't benefit from each other. So it's kind of a one-way process where we provide guidance or learn from colleagues on the ground, but they really appreciated the fact that they could actually, as a community, compare notes and experiences. So I think there's something in there we should definitely follow up.
Thank you so much, Charles Antoine, for this information. Very, very important. Anyone else, colleagues? Anita, do you want to come in?
Hi, everybody. No, just to build on what Hamed was saying, I would like to, to stress it and to also bring a light a little bit on the person with the psychosocial disabilities, because I think that inclusion of person with psychosocial disabilities is key in both humanitarian settings and developmental settings. And I think it would be great if they could be part of designing particularly the CFM, because we know that they don't use the CFM, and very often it's due to, not equal opportunity for access.
Thank you so much. Very good point, Anita. Steen, over to you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, really good to hear some of the progress that has been made on the ground. I think that's where we will learn, and really a lot. I just wondered while I was listening to the updates and thinking about the way forward, whether we couldn't also put an emphasis both on advocacy within the wider system as part of the results group 2, but also looking at how we roll it out on the ground, which like bearing in mind like the importance of localization, and that we would try to incorporate maybe a sort of litmus test where we look at a certain response and see which issues have emerged, maybe not through our own systems. I'm thinking, of course, like sexual abuse cases in Eastern DRC, or and see whether that came up through our own systems. And maybe they did, but it could give us a good insight on what happened with them, how was it dealt with, because often that is, of course, like protection cases, etc. And it's important that that work gets done. But the linkage with AAP is, of course, not just having an individual follow-up, but like seeing how the system works and how we can make the system more accountable. And sort of a review, put that into our work plan for next year, where we say, okay, this came up through other channels like Human Rights Watch or maybe the New Humanitarian or other channels. Can we reverse engineer or review maybe that context, see where we're working? Did this come up through our own systems? What happened with it? How was it dealt with? Again, not just from a pure like case handling position, but with that AAP lens. And I think that to me is somewhat of a next step to take in the AAP conversation, is not to set up really strong and inclusive, which obviously we all care about and should get more attention, systems, but also what happens outside of our own system, and see if that teaches us something. So I thought maybe that was a point, the advocacy point being there, that we should maybe create an AAP framework that also looks at those things that fall outside of our own systems, that don't come up through our own systems.
Thank you so much, Steen. And there are a number of comments in the chat. Maybe colleagues, you want to come in to make the discussion a bit more lively. So we have Christina, and then Eileen, and then Linda.
Good afternoon, my colleagues. I hope you can hear me. Usually it's my colleague Charlotte Lancaster who connects and interacts more, but I understand she is on a retreat, so I am participating instead. Yes, I was just commenting in the chat, building on what Charles-Antoine had said. Very interesting webinar indeed. I found it very useful with a particularly practical approach. And one of the most interesting take was the need to move away from the CFM as complaint mechanisms, rather community feedback mechanisms. So not only focusing on the negative part, but also a more general, regular dialogue with communities. And now that I have the floor, I think one important point, as was also highlighted by David Catrud during the past OPEC meeting, is that we have now as a priority a strong focus on AAP, but where is the inclusion? So I think that's one part that we could try to maintain also, because it connects, it's a connector of various aspects. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it did resonate with all of us also in the OPAC meeting, the inclusion element. We don't want to see it lost. Eileen, do you want to come in?
Thanks so much. No, I just wanted to flag that I think it's important that we sort of brainstorm how we want to focus on this area of work. I definitely agree that, you know, a good feedback and reporting or response mechanism is only a good one if it is actually inclusive and designed through participatory means with children and communities. So for me, it's sort of it's a given that we need to focus on that if we talk about AAP. And I also acknowledge some of the comments around PSCA. In Save the Children, we've been very conscious of linking up with our safeguarding staff to make sure that, you know, we don't have various different approaches to safeguarding and having a feedback and reporting mechanism, but really designing that together and making sure those linkages are very clear and that approaches reinforce another rather than happen in silos. And I guess my last point was just to encourage others to think about the how. There's so much guidance in the pipeline. Individual agencies have lots of guidance. More guidance is not going to be the solution. More tools is not going to be the solution. And we risk overwhelming staff who have to focus on implementation if that is all we produce. So creating platforms for shared learning, for brainstorming, for advocacy, as Stijn was pointing out, I think will be critical. But let's maybe, make the most of what we already have in terms of guidance and tools rather than producing even more.
Thank you so much. Linda, you also have a very interesting comment. Do you want to share it?
Sure, I'll try to be brief, but just that, I mean, I've been working with a lot of folks remotely, unfortunately, but in the field who are still really struggling with how to set up a CFM and to make it useful for the people that we're trying to serve. And also because I've been working with a country that's much more in a development context, because those folks aren't necessarily tied into a lot of the work that the IASC is doing, they don't know where to go to look for guidance, et cetera. And so I think, as UN country teams are being required to set up PSEA networks in country, I think we also maybe need to figure out how we can take everything that we've learned and package it for our colleagues in the development context and to help to support them.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you so much, Linda. Tom, you have a comment on clusters. Do you want to come in or?
I'm not sure I have much to add from the actual comment. That we deal with a really important range of cross-sectoral issues, and I think it's important that we're looking at those because they often get missed. But I wonder to what extent we should be engaging more directly with the global clusters to ensure uptake of these tools, and that we have allies who may be more focused on specific sectors to improve AAP and inclusion within their sectors. I was also just typing a second comment. I wonder if there's something around the new working with the Global Protection Cluster to ensure that their new protection analytical framework is applied alongside the AAP tools, and looking at an inclusion lens to see whether there are country-specific context analyses are adequately looking into issues around exclusion. And this group would be quite well placed to ensure that that intersectionality is really looked at, given that the role it has in linking up gender reference group, disability reference group, and other constituencies who are interested in other aspects of diversity and discrimination. So that might be an interesting thing to add to the long list for the 2022 work plan. Thanks.
Yeah, definitely in UNICEF, where we're hosting 3 or 3.5 clusters, we are, our colleague Charles Antoine is working directly with the clusters, and I'm sure that in the other clusters is happening the same, but it's a very good point. Okay, the chat is very lively now, so I don't know if I can catch up with all the comments. Fanman, do you want to come in?
Thank you. No, yes, I was just saying that about the one thing we picked up from we did consultations quite extensively was nobody really wanted to use the C anymore because of that, because we were drawing very much on. One of the things we found was that there actually is an enormous amount of guidance out there on feedback mechanisms. A lot of it very focused from areas that need inclusion as well. But the interesting we found was the fact that a lot of these lessons could be, even though they were very focused on inclusion areas and protection areas, they could be used more widely. And so one of the things we'd say is the fact that what we try to work on Substream 1 was that it really was, in a way, was like how to use direct people to the enormous guidance available, and also to get over the C. There was so much conversation what the C meant and what it should mean, but once you took that away, everybody was kind of in agreement that community-based and ground-up participatory routes worked, and how everybody agreed to do it. But it was a barrier because people saw it as reactive when it comes to the C, and that reaction was not useful. So notice I'm just using C right now rather than saying anything else. As an example. So anyway, that's what we want to say was, yeah, there is a lot of guidance out there, and it is really critically important that we see them as feedback mechanisms generally, and they are necessary at every single stage of the process, right from beginning to end, from design to conclusion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This is a very rich discussion with a lot of points for us then to capture and try to impress into the direction of the 2022 task force, because it's not going to be called a resource group anymore. There are some colleagues that they have some comments there. Maybe you want to come in, Katie?
Hi, I don't actually have much more to add. I was just agreeing with I think colleagues from Internews on their point around doing after action reviews to see when we've actually sort of the existing systems and complaint mechanisms we have and how they behave when we know that there were kind of large systemic issues. I think that was a really good point. So I was just reacting to that.
Okay. Sting was bringing some controversial points. You want to bring it to the discussion, Sting?
Yeah, like it's controversial because it's also hard to argue against protection and inclusion. Obviously, I do deeply care about that, and I think we all should, increase our efforts to always get that as good as we can, the best possible. But like I do think there's a risk that when we started doing accountability work and we talked about AAP, and there has been a large overlap, and that's normal with the protection work. But I think it's not just protection work that we're looking at when we talk about AAP. And while I think because we all share that concern, and there is a lot of expertise that is much older than the AAP conversation, we've been building on those systems as well, just out of pragmatic reasons, I think. And yet there is a risk that we that gets a lot of weight in the way that we look at AAP. There is an element of AAP that really should be make us embarrassed, and I honestly feel that when it is outsider actors that like flag things that have gone wrong during a response that did not come through our own systems, then I'm like, I'm sorry, but like that's for me showing that we have not yet nailed it. And if we need actors like Human Rights Watch or others to tell us what has gone wrong, then our accountability mechanisms are not really working. And maybe they did, and maybe there was an element where through a protection line of work, some of it was actually addressed. But I think AAP is also being accountable and saying, well, we fucked up, there's something that went wrong, not 3 years after, right? But actually during the response. That should be our ambition. And I know that like all the people around this virtual table, like, I mean, I know we all care about this, but like, let's look at ways that we can build a system that we shouldn't rely on others to point out when things go wrong. I think that's quite frankly a little bit embarrassing. And I hope that everybody feels that a little bit that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. And I remember Martin Griffith says that we don't have this right yet. So he acknowledged that we have a long way to go in trying to truly get the voice of the people into the programs that we are developing or funding or implementing. Okay, quite a lot of ideas there. Anything else? I mean, we're picking up on your ideas about inclusion and what to I mean, I see here from Serena on analysis of feedback data. Serena, do you want to come in?
Yes, thanks, Marichel. I was just answering or commenting on someone else's comment. I work at the Global Education Cluster, so I totally agree that clusters could be a relevant place for partners to discuss and share information on received feedback, concerns reported by affected communities. But in this case, then partners should also be willing and able to share this kind of information, because in my capacity, I've been asking for this kind of information and it doesn't always come to the cluster level. So it should be really, again, a two-way communication. But I really support the idea that clusters, I'm speaking for the education cluster, can be a relevant place for this kind of joint conversations to happen.
Okay, maybe we can also organize a conversation with the clusters at some point in 2022. That would be maybe interesting. Or invite them to one of our meetings in 2022. Okay, there is a point of better use of analysis of feedback data. We have taken note of that. Any other priorities that you could think of in the context of what Bernadette has explained for 22-23? We could also analyze everything that you have shared and then maybe propose some priorities to you for discussion over email. That would be another possibility. Yes, Bernadette.
Before we continue, I just wanted to be sure, Isabel, will it be possible to capture the chat comments into the minutes of our meeting today?
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
I'll come in afterwards again, Marichel, if you allow me.
Okay.
But I think somebody, maybe Moira, wanted to come in.
Yeah.
Yes, Moira.
Rachel, can I draw your attention to the comment of Rosie Jackson, who proposes also to look at the engagement before action? I think that's an area that has not yet been captured.
Okay, yes, I missed this
Rosie,
one. Rosie, do you want to come in?
Oh, hi, everyone. Yes, actually, I think it was probably covered in a more complete way by other colleagues. We talked about talking with the clusters, I think probably linking to, I guess when we've been reflecting on feedback mechanisms, and I know it's not always the case, but it's an after action review. It's, we've made our decision and then we go back to communities and we say, like, how did we do? What do you think? And we're just wondering whether we can expand that and look at engagement and inclusion by just making the most of join up on these feedback mechanisms and making them more like engagement mechanisms and expanding. We know that we've been developing channels of communication and engagement mechanisms through all of the actors around this virtual table, but how can we use that, maybe expand our approaches to explore I guess it is closing the loop, but it's also closing the loop between some of the conversations that happen at a cluster level, but also at the intercluster level during the decision-making processes around how we design our programs. So that was the comment.
Thank you so much. And there is also a number of comments about how do we break the barriers between what our colleagues in the field know and see, and how is then it reported and escalated, because as we all know, there are cases, but unless you have very clear evidence, colleagues from the field will not escalate them, but the journalists very easily will pick them up and put them in the media. So that's an important one, how to break all those barriers. Sylvie, do you want to come in?
Yeah, maybe. Thank you. Just sharing a few thoughts here. One thing is I'm hearing that we should focus on feedback mechanisms. And it looks like we are going back to the 80s, isn't it? Participation, feedback, population being at the center of da-da-da. So the question may be, why isn't it working? And we all know that the system is not ready to absorb all what is available. And maybe one strategic work to be done in 2022 is really observing what are the barriers within the humanitarian architecture. If the system is not ready to absorb anything. You can take the hammer, you can have your nail, and you can try the best, you know, but it won't fit, it won't enter. And this is a little bit where we are at. Now, there are places where we have planted seeds, like in Gaziantep. Thanks to, Mark Cutts was very, very supportive. So you see that leadership is important. And AAP and PSEA have come together, and we speak much more about people-centered approaches. So the other point I wanted to share here is maybe we don't need to speak about topics, but going back to people, and this is what you've put up front in the portal. We speak about people-centered approaches, and then we have AAP, inclusion, PSEA, etc., etc. So maybe going back to what we want to do is shifting the power. Okay, is that feasible or not? If it's not, or if we don't want to do it, then all the rest will be very good literature, and the gap between the theory and the field will increase and increase. Of course, it's much more difficult to go this way than to build new guidances and to revise the tools we have. I'd like to say also, for example, in Ethiopia, we created this joint working group on putting together both networks, AAP and PSEA, to work on the CFMs. The problem was not the CFM itself. The problem was about skills, about will, about politics, etc. If you take it technically, it's really easy. So are we looking on the right side? If we continue like this, I mean, we all have a lot of work to do. It's comfortable in a way. Intellectually, we can go very far, but we are not really resolving anything. So again, people-centered approaches back to what we want to achieve and what are the barriers in the system. If we don't leverage those barriers, if we don't work on this, then the rest is not going to achieve a lot. And maybe also the other point is at the time that humanitarian needs are increasing. What about value for money? Okay, having this as an indicator on all what we're going to do now on those aspects. We are putting a lot of energy and money and people, resources, etc. into this. So is it worth? Is it interesting to continue? I think that's a good question also. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. There is a lot of life in the chat, but I think I'm going to go now over to Bernadette to wrap up, because we have to move to the PSEA review findings. It's very much linked to what you are discussing, so maybe we should discuss that. And also the ODI paper on participation and inclusion in the Rohingya refugee response in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So Bernadette, over to you on this wrap up for this session.
Okay, you want me to wrap up? It's an impossible job. No, it was fantastic, and thank you for the last intervention, but also everything that has been said and written. We'll make sure that I hope you can still hear me.
Yes.
Okay. I will try. We will try to make sure we are very faithful in the minutes, in really capturing everything that you suggested. Maybe one question that I still have, and I understood from many interventions, really the need to socialize this more, to do advocacy. Many of you have mentioned the clusters, the global protection cluster, the reference groups. We've not talked about the grand bargain, and my reflection and question is, we've tried over the past 2 years since the establishment of Resource Group 2 to really work closely with the reference groups on MHPSS, on gender, on disability inclusion, and we have not been, as well as, of course, colleagues from the Grand Bargain, but certainly more could be done and should be done. And there are some nuts that we have not been able to crack there. And I just wanted to invite your reflections on those. So, Mary-Chelle, I think a lot has been said. I cannot really wrap this up, but I think we have a lot of excellent suggestions on what could be 4 or 5 big priorities. But I finish by saying that, of course, the power shift is what is the most important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. And I mean, they keep coming. Please, colleagues, continue to write in the chat as we go along, because we are going to capture every idea in the chat. And even later, if you want to share with us by email, we are open for Christmas. so please share with us. Maybe we should move now to the next agenda item, which is the PSEA review findings and the priorities for 2022. Wendy and Moira, are you coming in? Who is first?
Yes, I'm just going to introduce the context, and then Moira will brief on the findings. So we had already presented the preliminary findings of the review at the HC retreat, first of all, to verify that the humanitarian leaders in the field did find themselves among both the case studies and the interviews that Moira has done, and many of you on this call as well were consulted for the review. We then did also present some preliminary findings in the October meeting of the principals before the roundtable on the 23rd of November. At the 23rd of November, there was, there was also a, Siri is talking to me. There was also a meeting in November with the deputies to discuss the review, which was circulated for comments to the ISC focal points. Principals met then on the 23rd. Moira gave an in-depth briefing to the principals, and the review was welcomed. Now we're getting a lot of requests to have the full report released, and that will be done soon. We're just finalizing some of the last touches. And since some of you on the call did not get to hear any of those presentations, I'm going to hand the floor to Moira to highlight some of the key findings, and then we'll talk about how some of these findings are going to be taken forward with the incoming champion. Over to you, Moira.
Good afternoon, I suppose. I've got 5 or 6 minutes, and I've got to summarize for you the findings based on 159 interviews, about 300 documents, and several rounds of consultation. The review approach and the process is in front of you right now, but we'll go straight to the next slide. And these are really the top line findings and conclusions we're going to talk you through. So the last review on ISC PSEA was done in 2010. So that was quite a long time ago. However, there is some longitudinal background there because I also did the 2010 review. So I'm able to really make a judgment in terms of where we've moved to, in terms of perceptions, in terms of leadership point of view since then, and that'll come up later. So the positive thing is that since 2010, what we have in place is we now have the tools and the foundation in place to work on an interagency basis. We've got the standards in place and endorsed, and the standards have been pretty constant over the last decade. We've got strategic priorities set in 2018 and reaffirmed this year. The ISC has basically invested in one interagency CBCM model and made a significant investment in that over the last 10 years. Just as the ISC has invested in one interagency network concept, which again, they've reinforced repeatedly over the last 10 years. We've got country level responsibilities and assigned and reinforced and supported in a way that they weren't in 2010. We've got guidance and tools developed. And where there's been interest, support and funding allowed, and that has been a consistent finding that where there has been delivery at field level, those 3 things have been in place. We've got interagency initiatives initiated. Next slide, please. So sorry, back one slide. I didn't realize you've moved on. So victim-centered approach. There are 4 themes the review is structured around. One is a victim-centered approach. The achievement is that over the last few years, there's been a global level consensus on the need to center all of our SEA and sexual harassment work around a victim-centered approach. And that is a very significant movement from 2010, where we found that we were primarily driven by reputational risk. At a leadership level, we are now driven by having and being able to demonstrate a victim-centered approach. However, country level staff are not necessarily aware of the commitments made or how to implement these across a response, plus the commitments that individual ISC members and indeed the UN as a whole have made to a victim-centered approach have not been discussed across the ISC. It's not clear how the ISC as a whole will move to ensure a victim-centered approach, will support it, will resource it, and will demonstrate it. There's an urgent need for that conversation to begin and for the barriers to that to be understood and overcome and demonstrated. Within that, there are other issues such as what does the INC intend to do to move on the 2018 commitments to ensure that investigations will become more victim-centered and to ensure that investigations are more timely and that we can evidence that those who need to get feedback on investigations are getting it in an appropriate and timely way. And that includes victims. For example, one recommendation that has been made repeatedly that the review report endorses is that we should be establishing collective independent investigation capacity in high-risk contexts while we look at what more will be possible collectively, nationally and globally. Next slide, please. I've already referenced the high reliance on the one IASC interagency communication, CBCM, communication and complaints mechanism. There is currently no evidence in place that CBCM guidance is being applied at country level, and that the knowledge that we already have on the barriers for complaint and the barriers for victims coming forward are being addressed. What we do find is that managers in the field may not be understanding and ensuring that they are making available the support and resources for the CBCM. The CBCM itself, and there's a commonality with some of the issues that I just heard you discussing in the last session when I came on the call, the CBCM itself may be too complex to be operationalized amongst diverse field actors. And there is a need for the IESC members to come together quickly to discuss the current model, to look at the rationalization of that and what they are prepared to do commonly to support its implementation at field level. In common with almost every other issue related to PSEA implementation at field level, there is a need for better monitoring of models, not reporting, but better monitoring of models to identify where they are working well, where they are not working, and to what extent the model itself is one that you should continue to invest in, and therefore provide yourselves with the evidence for scale up and sustainability of those models. Next slide, please. This is the good news slide. Contrary to 2010, all leaders interviewed at global level and at national level fully accept that PSEA is their responsibility, fully understand the nature of the responsibility that they've been provided with, are all able to provide examples of where they have discussed this with their staff, are able to provide examples of how they are discussing this with their management teams and their leadership teams. There is also a broad and shared agreement about the relationship between power and SEA, and that this is very much a part of the ongoing discussion about the need for structural change within agencies and within the humanitarian sector. And there is a desire for the ISC to lead on that. However, all leaders also feel that they have not yet been provided with sufficient resources to deliver the change that's required and to meet their obligations on PSEA and sexual harassment. The review found that even though it had been recommended and endorsed as a recommendation in 2010, PSEA is not yet mainstreamed across clusters and sectors. And I'll go further than that in this company. The mainstreaming across clusters and sectors doesn't appear to even have structurally begun, except in 2 or 3 contexts. PSEA is not a systematic part of surge and scale up in response to crisis, despite frequent recommendations that have been made in the past on that. However, there has been some progress made on reference checking, although alignment within the systems is required. Next slide, please. Very briefly on sexual harassment, which the review also looked at. At the global level, there is an intent and a commitment, as you know, to drive change on this issue related to change on power within our organizations. However, many leaders at the country level were not aware of these ISC commitments, and it appears to be a more challenging issue for leaders to discuss, to articulate, and for leaders to be able to discuss with their managers and the teams the type of change that is required. In that way, there's very much echoes of the findings in 2010 around SEA when it comes to looking at sexual harassment in 2021 and leadership confidence on the issue. The review concluded that there was going to need to be a sustained effort by senior management across all ISC members to prevent and address sexual harassment, as commitments were made in 2018 and reaffirmed in 2021. Last slide, please. So in summary, the foundations are established, pilots have been conducted, and there is a substantial amount of guidance available, perhaps too much for the field to absorb. The commitments that have been made over the years by the principals, including in the acceleration plan of 2018 and the strategy from 2018, which was reaffirmed in 21, they seem to be broadly the right strategic outcomes. However, without targets underneath them and without a multi-year plan, it's going to be very difficult to evidence that you're working towards these commitments. Therefore, there's a need to move from 1 year to 5-year planning and establish targets which you secure funding against, which is something that donors that I interviewed said they were open to discussing. There's a need to monitor progress at country level, not by more reporting, not by necessarily increasing the indicators that are there, but by having capacity to do real-time monitoring in high-risk contexts and transfer that learning rapidly across a coherent cadre of personnel, drawing in cluster leads, sector leads, and other technical focal points to take up their own responsibility on the matter. That's the way that the ISC approach and model can be argued and advocated to become mandatory in every humanitarian context. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Moira. Wendy, are you coming in now, or do you have any other
do we have some time for some quick questions or reactions before we move to how some of these findings will be taken forward?
Yes, colleagues, any questions? Otherwise, Wendy, maybe It's a lot to absorb. Yes, I fully agree. So maybe Wendy, you can walk us through the 2022 priorities. What is next? Over to you.
Gareth is online. I think he's going to speak a little bit. Thank you, Moira, so much. That was very clear. And I think it'll be easier once we are able to distribute the full report. The idea is there will also be a meeting of the deputies in January to look at which are the priority areas they want to take forward, and also hearing from the ones that the champion is proposing to put their weight behind. So over to you, Gareth, perhaps.
Yeah, so there's so as you know, SCHR is taking on the ISC Championship, so we'll be working very closely with Wendy and the Secretariat on looking at how we support the collective PSEAH efforts. And we've really taken the report that you've just been briefed on as our kind of starting point. And in particular, one of the recommendations that Moira made was the need to be kind of clearer and more consultative about how we set the priorities for the champion, who will be my colleague Andrew Morley from World Vision, who takes the SCHR chair in January. So what we're proposing is we're looking to keep it focused. So just say within the championship we have 3 priorities. That's not to say we're only doing 3 pieces of work. Obviously, collectively, we're doing many, many more than that. But we wanted to really focus on areas where we felt a champion, as in a high-level principal who runs a big organization, who can really push things through, can make a particular difference. And we thought it'd be very useful to have one priority that's very much focused on affected people. One that's focused on a country level priority, and then one that's a systemic element. And so what I'll be sending a little bit later today, and I'll be sending it to Maricel and Bernadette to circulate to the mailing list, is a consultation. So what we've done is we've put together 6 options, 2 under each of those domains, that we think are areas where the new champion will be able to build on the work of previous champions and really move us collectively forward. And so those, if I just quickly, I'll run through those options, but we'll send you more detail when I get the message finished later today. So on the affected population focus ones, the 2 key options are, one is to look at the current CBCM, and thank you for the earlier discussion, because I think that will also really inform this. But really push that, look at how we get the political support through our organisations to make that change happen, to make any of the changes that we take on board from Moira's report, and make that happen in practice. The second option, the B option, is around really pushing the survivor-centred element, and not just in terms of support services for survivors who survive, but also the way we're survivor-centred in everything, in how we run investigations, how we manage complaints, how we the assumptions we make and the cultural shift we make to be survivor-centred. So those are the 2 that are focused on affected, and we'll be asking you to make a choice between these and give your reasons, so that when we come back with the priorities in January, you'll have we'll have a very clear logic that's hopefully broadly supported on why we think these should be the championship priorities for 2022. On the country level ones, so the 2 that have come out of that, one is around the field guide, taking the recommendation that Moira just shared with us about the huge library of resources we've got there, and packaging it much more for non-AAP, non-PSEA specialists, but for generalist leaders, so for programme managers, for frontline staff, and really kind of boil that down to these are the key things that will really drive change. And then the B option there is around kind of putting in a bit more focus to support Wendy and the Secretariat to put together the 5-year plan that Moira has recommended. On that one, I think my personal preference is around the 5-year plan. We're already talking with potential champions for 2023, so particularly with our colleagues in some of the UN agencies. So really looking forward to those. So those are the 2 options on the country level. So that was the 5-year plan to deploy to sustainably fund and deploy the coordinators. So we know that's been an issue we've been talking about in the TEG for some time. And then the final two at the global systems level, that's the 5-year kind of plan that Moira was recommending, that we need a longer term approach to this. And the second option there is around pushing the culture change element. So those are the two options there. Thanks, Maricel. I appreciate the timing here. So basically, all that will be coming to you in an email later today. So do please engage with that. The more kind of inputs we can get from results groups and TEG members, the more informed that will be. So looking forward to that. Back to you, Maricel.
Thank you so much, Gareth and Moira and Wendy. Any other point, Wendy, from your side? Or I don't see any hands coming up, but any questions from anyone? Okay, so then maybe we should move, as the colleagues have said, it's a lot to absorb. Let's move maybe to the next presentation today. It's a presentation by Oliver Lott from ODI, the HPG Humanitarian Policy Group, about the findings of research done in Cox's Bazar about participation and inclusion. So over to you, Oliver.
Thank you very much, Maricel, and apologies to colleagues who've already heard a lot of my voice at the recent CDAC meeting. I will try and keep this as quick as possible. So this is, I'm just going to take you very quickly through the results of a study we did over the course of last year on participation and inclusion in the Rohingya crisis in Cox's Bazar. Just very briefly in terms of what the methodology was, it was qualitative. We worked with IOM, who have a team of Rohingya who have been trained in anthropological research approaches, which is why we engaged in that partnership. And we spoke to around 100 affected people across 5 camps and around 70 humanitarian actors in terms of kind of the demographic makeup of who we were talking to. Next slide, please. So just before we go into detail, I feel the question of participation versus AAP speaks to a lot of what's been going on in the chat around kind of the breadth and scale of some of these discussions. But just very briefly to explain where we're coming from, we were taking quite a broad view of participation as people's ability to be involved in decisions that affect their lives. So rather than narrowing it to AAP or another aspect. And we wanted to explore a bit more kind of what the link with participation and inclusion is, because it's something that's often talked about. But we felt it's important to nuance this a bit, in that it's not just that participation is part of inclusion and that you need your participation to be inclusive, although that's really important. But we see participation as potentially a way to actively address questions of exclusion. And there are sort of 2 key issues here. One is related to the fact that participation is a right, and it's often kind of ignored and is a right denied. But it's also a vehicle to make other rights claims. And given that exclusion is often bound up in people's rights being denied or ignored, this is a really important point. So it's a way to theoretically get rights back and be included. It's also important for exclusion in that it plays a role in building solidarity as well as making claims. So participation creates a space for people to come together and think about why they're being excluded. And this is especially important for marginalized groups where they may not have had a chance to do this or have been excluded from doing this by existing power dynamics. And just finally, it's important in that it flips the script and again puts affected people at the center of responses, so viewing them as active agents rather than just sort of passive beneficiaries, which is again at the core of inclusion. Next slide, please. And this is obviously important in the Rohingya crisis because the lack of participation is both a root and proximate cause of a lot of the issues the Rohingya face today. So not being able to vote, not being able to take part in civil society, not being able to run for office, these are all contributors to being pushed out of being citizens, being viewed as less than human, not being able to push back against any of this, and eventually being driven out of the country. And at the same time, in Bangladesh, the Rohingya historically have not really had much of a say in a lot of the discussions around relocation or how previous responses have run, which have kind of contributed to this cycle of displacement ongoing since the 70s. Next slide, please. And next slide again. So I'll just take you very briefly through our findings. We appear to have missed a slide, but that's fine. But just very briefly, just in terms of how affected people perceive participation within the response, there is this overwhelming sense that the response is stuck in consultation mode, rather than focus on sort of action-oriented two-way dialogue. So people see humanitarian consultations as very program focused and not necessarily framed in a way they would like to see it or in a way that reflects their priorities. So one of our respondents talked about the way these consultations were out of sync with how the Rohingya would like to have those discussions. There's this sense of things being very ad hoc and not like the two-way dialogue that participation in the AAP aspires to, not really happening, of people coming into communities, asking them questions, leaving again, never being seen again, or not speaking to the same people again. And this just being experienced as a very alienating process. And this was coupled with a sense that the people who were talking to them were a long way from where the decisions were actually being made. And people are pretty clear-eyed about where that leaves them on the ladder of power and the level of influence that they have. And even at the stage of complaints mechanisms, there's a sense that, yes, these things exist, but they're quite intimidating. They're quite hard to navigate. And you have to rely on proxies, and sometimes it's just easier to simply not engage because it's a pain, or it's scary, or it's a miserable experience. So just very briefly looking at kind of why people have these perceptions, there's no getting around the fact that it's a really tough response in which to do participation. The political space for doing so, as well as kind of the micropolitics within the camps, make some of these things extremely challenging. And I want to acknowledge that. This is not to say this is a piece of cake and you guys aren't doing it properly. That's simply not the case. And it's also important to recognize that being marginalized in the past affects how people can participate in the present. So it's pretty hard to engage with a complaints mechanism if you feel it's not your place, if you lack confidence, if you're illiterate, or if you're a woman, if you can't leave the house. So that it is, again, a really challenging environment. But there are factors within the response that are not helping. And one of these, which we've come back to, speaks to earlier parts of this meeting, is the question of leadership. It's great to hear that there's more structure being piloted in Cox's Bazar, but at the time it was kind of fragmented between different organizations and different working groups in terms of who was doing what around kind of setting the direction or the tone of how the response was viewing accountability and viewing participation. There was also a question of staff attitudes, both kind of international and national, but this idea that kind of we are doing this response for the Rohingya. And to be frank, there were some really nakedly paternalistic and, to be honest, racist attitudes in some of the staff that we were interviewing around how they saw the Rohingya. One of them was saying you can't give them control. It's like giving a gun to a child. And it is important to flag that kind of at the field level, especially, these are attitudes that staff have towards affected people. And this is, in the Rohingya crisis, deeply exacerbated by the fact that Rohingya can't be staff. And can't be on teams to combat that otherizing in a meaningful way. There's also a question of kind of risk aversion within the response, and kind of while it's a very challenging environment, the sense that participation may be not worth the risk, and not necessarily talking to affected communities around kind of where, why this is the case and what people's risk appetites might be in the community itself. Next slide, please. So one key element of participation is representation, the idea that not everyone gets to or is particularly interested to take part in every discussion or every decision that affects them, but that they rely on proxies to do so. And here we saw a tension between the representative systems that humanitarians prefer to engage with or prefer to set up and those that exist in the community. So there were things like block level committees set up by camp management actors, or kind of a lot of sector committees set up by WASH or by Protection. And while these do perform an important role, they didn't really come up as particularly meaningful or touching a lot of people's lives when we spoke to communities themselves. Whereas the kind of the Margis, who some of you will know as the gatekeepers of the response and very problematic in a lot of ways, were still seen as critical, and they were critical because people listened to them and they knew the system and they helped people navigate this very opaque set of complaints and feedback environments. At the same time, you had humanitarians kind of engaging with these community-based systems, problematic as they are, in not necessarily very nuanced ways. So you could have people saying the Margis are really bad, but still kind of using them as a proxy for getting distribution lists, or just kind of not really engaging with some of the more organic local committees that have formed. So this tension between kind of not being comfortable with engaging with local structures and setting up your own, which aren't really relevant, isn't yet really resolved. On an inclusion point, setting up some of these committees is specifically designed to make them more inclusive. So to make sure that, unlike the local committee, there are women or there are people with disabilities, and this is a really good aspiration. But it can be a bit by the numbers, and there's this idea of that if you have someone there, they can participate, which isn't necessarily true if you haven't thought through kind of why socially in general they are marginalized or haven't been allowed to participate in other systems. Next slide, please. So this is just echoing something that was said in the chat, really, is that there are going to be no silver bullets, and there is this sense of what participation is for and what representation is for, is this idea of whatever body we engage with has to be representative, and this question of a need to think through a bit more kind of what are constituencies, who is representing whom. Not everything is going to be solved with elections. Civil society represents interests rather than constituencies. There's a lot of talk about we don't know how representative different Rohingya civil society groups are. No civil society group is representative of a specific body of people. There are always interests, and the need to sort of think pragmatically about how these different types of representation intersect. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up, one thing that comes out quite clearly from the study is that there is quite a narrow understanding of what participation is for in the response, and it's largely around strengthening program effectiveness and making sure that programs are more responsive to people's needs, which is really important, but it's not all that participation writ large is for. As I said earlier, it is a right. It shouldn't be optional, and this does kind of frame how participation ends up being done. So just the best example I can give is, currently you have accountability that is mostly based on feedback, which is, we'll take your opinions, thank you very much, you may leave a complaint in the complaints box, but it's not necessarily around holding actors to account on agreed standards. So kind of trying to shift the lens from the doctors are really mean to us in the clinic to you have given us certain obligations about how you will run your clinic, and we would like to see you uphold those, and we would like a framework and a way to do that systematically, and that there's not really evidence of that happening. We did see some really good examples of kind of more open approaches to participation that are run around rights and are run around solidarity by inclusion organizations. And so people were setting up help groups for people with disabilities or for older people, where the objective wasn't run this program better. It was these people have not had a chance to get together and talk and think together, and that's going to be the starting point, and they will take it where they want to go. That may then be linked up with your programming later on, but we're not going to base it around service delivery. Next slide, please. So final point I'll make here is just the question of timelines, and this is linked to kind of what participation is for, but we know that this crisis is going to rumble on for a while unless something really bad happens involving reform in the next few months. There is a need, even though it is still a humanitarian setting, for humanitarians to start thinking more like development actors around participation if they want it to be more effective. That involves both having much longer timelines on stuff, so allowing space for co-creation of projects rather than do an assessment and we design the project, allowing space for building trust, and allowing time for working on really, really tough issues of marginalization of some really vulnerable people that can't be done on year-long or 6-month project cycles. And it also involves kind of expanding out your objectives and your scope of what participation is for. So thinking around, is this just to improve program delivery? Or as I've said, is this around empowerment? Is this around meeting some needs of the community that long-term are desperate, but aren't humanitarian needs? They're political needs or they're civil needs. I will leave it there and open it up to questions.
Thank you so much, Oliver. Colleagues, a very rich sorry, I don't know, there's echo now. I can hear myself through your speakers, Oliver. Yeah. There's a question from Amit. Over to you, Amit.
First of all, immense thanks for that presentation. Really eye-opening and absolutely excellent. Very close to home. My family is from Bangladesh. I wanted to ask you, honestly, just for your guidance and advice on something that has been a challenge for me for a long time, which is that working with community structures is one of the key components of more community-oriented work, humanitarian work. But so often those community structures are dominated by individuals that are not representative of the various needs and profiles and sectors of the community, including those that may most urgently require humanitarian assistance. And sometimes we know that community structures can be dominated by persons who hold significant power and privilege relative to others themselves. So very often male-dominated, majority culture-dominated, even within a displaced population in terms of religious denominations, language denominations, ethnic denominations, and very often male-dominated. I wanted to ask you for some practical advice on how to ensure that community structures can be more effective in representing a broader spectrum of voices, particularly those that are least heard and least often heard. Thank you so much.
$1,000,000 question, and I wish I had more practical advice, but I can throw out a few implications from what we've been looking at. I guess the first point is sort of thinking about when you're talking about community, it's going to depend a lot whether you're looking at isolated villages or this large, a large camp setting or an urban setting. But thinking about if these community structures are dominated by men or by power holders, are there other ways that are not necessarily representative at the same level, or whether it's at the block unit or at the village unit, that can involve marginalized people that you may need to work with on parallel tracks and maybe link them back later? So, for example, UN Women were doing quite a lot of work on women's leadership programs and supporting women-led organizations, which weren't necessarily functioning at the kind of community level, but were able to, exercise power and influence within the response and to feed into some community structures eventually. So thinking about this multiple entry points thing, I think it's also important to kind of not take a cookie cutter approaches in different responses. So thinking about when you have powerful people, what is the source of their power? And for the Margis, a lot of the source is where they're positioned within the response and their ability to gatekeep where assistance goes, but they don't necessarily have a huge amount of social basis for their power, which might distinguish them from other contexts and other places like Somalia, where you have sort of hugely powerful clan networks or land ownership kind of backing that power up. So actually thinking about kind of what power and how it's wielded. Other stuff is again thinking through kind of what these systems do and don't do. So you might have a not very inclusive male-dominated committee that actually a lot of people find performs functions that work for them, even in a not particularly inclusive way. And so are there elements of that can either be replicated through other forms, or are there elements of that you can work with while needing to balance out other elements? So one really interesting example was in some camps, they set up a female counterpart to the Margi, and it had the same power dynamics issues, like quite often it was the Margi's wife. But for women, it is an entry point to complaints mechanisms that they can't otherwise access. And for the community, it is a woman in a legitimated leadership role that is not otherwise there. So again, thinking sort of pragmatically where your entry points are. Sorry, that's quite fragmented. We do have another research project that's looking on dealing with gender norms in crises, so I will point you in that direction as well.
Thank you so much. Amit, I still see your hand up. Is this a previous hand?
Give me previous hand. That was such a helpful answer. Really love to learn more. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you have more information in the chat about the link to the study, the Twitter thread, etc., etc. Well, so thank you so much, Oliver. This was really, we have one comment from Steen. Steen, over to you.
Yeah, just a brief thought, and this is really interesting, obviously, and also to me, it also highlights the importance of how we either rely on existing structures like the Margi or set up new ones, but in both cases, think that does the job. And I really feel like in the AP discussion and the importance of communication and making sure that information also is available outside of those systems actually is an important element of accountability, because it means that everybody knows what they're entitled to, how the systems work, etc. And it's not reducing the element of gatekeeping, of course, and like where we work as internews. And this is not to do self-promotion, because that's boring, but like we actually see that local structures often are thankful rather than challenging us for going out like besides them in parallel ways. I mean, of course, we talk to them, we involve them where we can. There's a lot of pressure from the community onto those Margis, or similar structures elsewhere. There's a lot of pressure from the humanitarian system on those local structures, and they're all expecting that these people can deliver in one way or another. And I think actually not thinking so much in systems, but more in approaches, is one way of getting out of that sort of conundrum, in my perspective. That was just a thought.
Thank you so much. Oliver, you want to come in to that point?
No, beyond saying that I completely agree with it. Just as a slight side point, I find the idea that community representatives in crises who are really asked to do a lot are never compensated, and it's always viewed as this voluntary position, is something we maybe need to start thinking about as a sector. And the same applies, this is another finding that came out of the research, the same applies to volunteers. And quite often there's a lot of, yes, people can participate because they can do the work as volunteers, and thinking if that people are volunteering and participating, but without being able to actually really make any decision, to what extent that's just exploitation rather than actually handing over control and meaningful participation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Any other final comments or questions to this presentation? One man is mentioning that there are no silver bullets, pluralistic entry points are essential. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much, Oliver. This was, I think, very interesting, and we will really read this with a lot of interest, and I'm sure that everyone will follow the discussions online and in the Twitters. Okay, so I think we have reached the end of the day for today. For some people that have meetings after this one, it would be good maybe to have a 5-minute break. So I just want to thank you all for, on behalf of Bernadette and myself, for all the amazing work that you have been doing in 2021. We have been here accompanying you basically, but the work has been done by all of you and by the amazing team that we have at the level of the Resource Group 2. I will not name all of you because you know who you are, but it has been really a pleasure to go with you through this journey in 2021 and really listen to the fantastic interventions that we had today. So this is a very good testament, I think, of the importance of this topic and all the areas that are still pending for 2022. The collaboration that we have, we hope that we can maintain it in 22 and 23 in the form of the task force. It will be a different way. It will be a way of engaging people, probably that will be a bit different, but we still need to see how this is going to work. And we are committed to, I mean, both Bernadette and I, if we are to continue chairing this group, we are both committed to continue with this chairing and with this work. And we will inform you as soon as we have something from the OPAC, any clear guidance for 2022 in terms of the form and also in terms of the priorities that we'll put together based on the interventions that you had today. We'll get back to you. So with that, we wish you a very restful end of the year, happy holidays, Merry Christmas if you're celebrating, and that you survive the end of the year with all the reporting and everything, because that is also a busy period of the year. And hopefully we will meet again in 2022, because we haven't finished the testing of the tools that we prepared in 2021, and definitely we have to feed back to the OPAC on the result of that operationalization of the tool. So we will be, as I said, open for Christmas for more questions, suggestions, and ideas for priorities for 2021. Bernadette, you want to say anything?
No, just to say that it has been really great to work with all of you over the past 2.5 years, and that, of course, we picked on one of the comments that was made in the chat also on if we could broaden further the participation into this work, to, in particular, have more regular participation from actors at the national, who are at the national or local level, who are not international NGOs, who are not UN agencies, and who make such a great difference. And really always provide a good reality checks for all our discussions at the global level. So we certainly are very attached to this principle of broadening, of being ourselves inclusive, actually. So we try to also reflect upon this comment and everything else you've said today. Thank you very much. We knew it would be great for us to hear from you about your reflections on what more needs to be done and what more we can collectively do. So we have been very satisfied with the discussion. Thank you very much, and I wish you all also a very happy end of the year. Thank you, and see you next year. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.